I want to start with a story, and we've been talking, I noticed it's been a bit of a theme to talk about the juvenile justice system, and I also want to talk a little bit about the juvenile justice system. We did a long project trying to improve the juvenile justice system in New York State. And in the course of that project, we met one youth who was in the system and had been in the system for 5 years. His initial offense was shoplifting a pair of sneakers. That led to his entry into the system. He lived in New York City, he got sent to a facility upstate, got separated from his parents, didn't get the educational resources that you would hope he would get. So when he was released, very shortly he was back in the system. This is a very common story in the juvenile justice system, not just in New York, but everywhere. But so 5 years later, from that initial incident of shoplifting sneakers, he was still in the juvenile justice system. So why does that happen? That's one of the reasons why we think collective impact is a good solution once you dig into why that happens. Is a lot of times you hear, well, we can't solve social problems because there aren't enough resources. Well, the juvenile justice system in New York State, if you added up all the resources of all the agencies, spends $286,000 per year per youth. So this is an example where you would hope that that would be enough resources. What does the state system get for that? 89% recidivism. For those of you unfamiliar with that term, that means 9 out of 10 youth who enter the system end up back in it. And of course, the purpose of the system is to rehabilitate youth so that they're not entering. So that is a pretty high failure rate. And I don't bring that up because I think the agencies and the organizations aren't doing their job or don't have good intentions. They all do. The problem is this. When you take a look at the system, I'll give that a second. It's extraordinarily complex. You have hundreds of agencies and organizations, all designed to, either help the youth or improve public safety. All designed with good purposes, all with good people working in them, all with the best intentions, and in this case, a fair amount of resources. But when you have so many agencies and organizations working together, they have different goals, they have different agendas, they have different folks they're accountable to, and you get a system where there's not a lot of coherence across it. And so the question is, how can you improve the coherence of these systems that are dealing with these complex social problems? Because it's not just one agency, it's not just one organization when you're talking about mental health, when you're talking about diabetes, when you're talking about child abuse, when you're talking about juvenile justice. These all look like this. And that's where collective impact comes in. But before I get into the details of collective impact, I want to step back a minute and think about types of problems. And so we'll talk about 3 types of problems that you find in the social sector and really everywhere. You have simple problems, baking a cake. It's not that hard to figure out how to do it. Once you do it, you have a recipe, you can replicate it. Pretty straightforward. There are complicated problems. How do you land a man on the moon? Well, that takes a long time to figure out. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of money. Once you've done it, you can do it again. It may be difficult. It may be expensive, but it can be replicated. Then you have complex problems. And the idea behind this is if you're educating a child, if you're raising a child, you all know what works with one child won't work with another. You're trying to get to the same outcomes, thriving, getting an education, but the interventions that work are different with each child. So in the social sector, we tend to think about problems as simple or complicated. I'd say mostly complicated. Most people realize, but we don't think about them so much as complex. And so the model has become identify the problem, design and pilot a solution. If that solution works in one place, scale it up and spread it. You can see that might not work as well if you're dealing with complex problems. What works in one place won't work in another place. What works in Olympia won't work in Yakima. And so just to give you a brief overview of how this generally works, funders and agencies select grantees or organizations. Those organizations work separately and they compete with each other for funding and recognition. The evaluation that happens is focused on isolating the effect of one organization or one intervention, and that large-scale change is assumed to depend on scaling those organizations or spreading those particular programs. And then finally, you get the social sector, the foundation, nonprofit sector working separately from the corporate and government sector in a lot of cases. And that leads to what we call isolated impact. You've got people doing good things in isolated pockets, but you don't have the kind of impact at scale that you're hoping to get. So we suggest and have seen people and have been on the ground in instances where folks are using a different approach, and it's early days yet, but there are some very promising initial outcomes. What you try to do in this approach in collective impact is you get all the organizations in a place working on an issue, working together toward the same goal and measuring the same things. You get all the sectors involved, corporate, government, nonprofit, philanthropic, and in working together as partners. And you have active coordination of organizations that are sharing lessons learned. If one organization innovates, that gets spread quickly across the system. And so this is something that a few years ago we observed this, FSG observed this, and we said, well, that's really interesting, and that seems to be working well. Let's write about it. And so we wrote about it, and we've seen it kind of, that article seemed to really resonate with folks, and a lot of people were doing this, but they didn't quite know how to articulate it, and so I think we helped do that. And so I want to give you a little bit of a definition of what collective impact is and what the elements that seem to be critical in it working are. Collaboration has been going on for a long time around social challenges, and there are all different kinds of collaborations that you find, and I won't go through all these. But the idea is that collective impact is a form of collaboration, but it's different in some pretty significant ways. One, it's cross-sector, so it's very important that all of the sectors involved and that touch on the problem are at the table. It's multi-stakeholder. In the ideal situation, you have everybody who's working on the issue participating. It's focused on a specific social problem, so it's not just a general collaboration, and it's also long-term. So people really have to be in it for quite a while. And so we would define it as a long-term commitment by a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a social problem. And there are some pretty clear elements that we've found to exist in efforts that are working. One is this common agenda. And this sounds easy, but actually we found it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months for people to agree on just what the goal is. It takes time for people just to agree. A lot of these folks have never been in the same room together. They've never really talked to each other. And so just agreeing on what the definition of something is. Recidivism, for instance, in juvenile justice, the different agencies, the different organizations had different definitions of recidivism. So you have to work past all that. You have to get folks using a common language and then developing a common understanding and figuring out a shared vision for change. Once you've got that, you can use that vision to build out what we call a shared measurement system, where there is a few important metrics that everybody's measuring and that become the baseline and the way that you're tracking progress. There's a lot of detail behind that and how that gets done, but the idea is that everybody is going to continue to measure all the different things that they measure, but in the collective impact effort, there are some metrics that everybody's tracking, which really helps with both knowing what's going on and also communicating what's going on. Mutually reinforcing but differentiated activities. This sounds more complicated than it is. It just means everybody's continuing to do different kinds of work, but there is some effort made at alignment and making sure you basically map out the issue and what the challenges are, and then you make sure that at least somebody is covering each of those challenges, that there are no gaps. Continuous communication. So this is both internally to the effort and externally folks who are not involved in the effort, what's happening, how are we making progress, what hasn't worked, what are our plans to address that. Within the effort, it really involves quite a few meetings, and meetings at which folks with decision-making power show up and participate. Because one of the things we found is necessary is to build trust in the community, to build trust among the leaders of organizations, among the staff of organizations, among the community members, that everybody knows what everybody else's agenda is and everybody's really committed to solving the problem. And then finally, and this is the one that you see missing most often, is backbone support. And really, we found this works best when there's an organization with dedicated staff to supporting the initiative, because so many of the other organizations and agencies that are working on these issues are really, really busy and under-resourced, and they don't have the capacity to also manage what is often a pretty complex effort to convene, to share information, to communicate. And so we found that it really works best if there's, in some way, there's a lot of forms and it can take, but that there's some kind of backbone organization support. We've seen these efforts succeed, take place and show some results in all kinds of, on all kinds of issues, all kinds of complex social problems. We've seen them in education, we've seen them in healthcare, homelessness, economic development, really any kind of complex social issue where there's a lot of different kinds of stakeholders and multiple sectors involved. We believe this can work. So what does it take to get started? What are the things that need to be in place to launch something like this? And we found three key things. One is an urgency for change, a sense that this has to get addressed now. And sometimes that's a lawsuit. Sometimes that's a piece of legislation that got passed. Sometimes it's a report that comes out. But there has to be a sense in the community that we really need to tackle this and we really need to commit to it. There also need to be champions in the community, people who are willing to get it started, people who are willing to commit time, commit energy, commit funding to starting the effort and bringing others in and making the case. And finally, there needs to be some level of financial resources. There's usually research to be done and convenings to be held, and so there has to be, it doesn't have to be a lot, but there has to be some level of financial resources available to get something like this started. Once they're started, what do they look like? Well, there's a first phase where you're really just getting going, initiating action, you're pulling the structure together, you're getting the group together, you're getting your kind of norms of communication sorted out, you're mapping the landscape, and you're bringing together all the data you need to identify gaps and to make the case for action. You're reaching out to the community, and you're analyzing that baseline data to see, okay, where do we need to go? And that phase usually ends once it takes a while to get a backbone organization in place usually. Once there is a backbone organization in place, you really move into phase two, which is organizing for impact. So you're creating the common agenda, you're engaging the community on a regular basis, you're establishing those shared metrics, and then once you've got that basic infrastructure set up, you just have to keep it going. You are using information to refine your strategy. You're helping to support the organizations that are doing the work. You're continuing engagement. You're maybe doing advocacy. Through the work, you've identified policies that would be helpful to change. Not everybody does that, but that's certainly one thing that some of the efforts do. And then you're also critically tracking progress and reporting out on progress. This is a complicated slide, but it just shows that it is fairly complex to orchestrate, but the virtue of the structure is that you're engaging the community and the organizations involved at all levels. You've got a steering committee, which is usually leadership of different organizations and leaders from the community. You've got a backbone, which is orchestrating all that. And then once it's going, you've got working groups, which are really working on specific strategies. So to take an example from education, if you're trying to improve post-secondary attainment, you'd have a working group perhaps on getting students college ready, so focused on the K-12 system. You might have a working group on the transition between K-12 and post-secondary, and then you might have a working group on what's going on in colleges, how can we keep students in post-secondary and make sure that they finish and get their degrees. And then you've got all the organizations, the partners who are doing the implementation, continuing to do their work, and then you've got community members who are engaged and are really keeping folks' feet to the fire and generating that public will that's important to keep the effort going. Shared measurement. This is, again, something that, of those 5 elements, something you see less than some of the others, because it takes effort to pull it together, but you basically have to get everybody at the table and identify common metrics that everybody can agree upon, that if we see these move, we know we're making progress. There are huge benefits to this. One is that the data quality improves if everybody's tracking the same things. You're enabling coordination because everybody knows what everybody else is working towards. You're facilitating learning for everybody who's working on the issue. And then finally, as you see the data come in, that can really help catalyze action. Either things will really move the needle, and so let's do more of it, Or, gosh, we tried that, we thought that would work. It's a year later, we see it didn't really make a difference. Maybe we allocate resources elsewhere. The other critical piece, backbone organizations, what do they do? And again, you can see there are a lot of things they do, which is why it's important that there be some dedicated capacity to this. So they're really the stewards of the strategy. The idea is that as the effort goes on, as this is a 5-year, 10-year effort, the strategy will evolve. Some things will get better, other things will emerge, and so there needs to be somebody who's kind of the custodian of that strategy and taking the data and refining the strategy as things go along. They support the activities of all the partners. They establish that shared measurement system and collect the data and keep that going, feed it back into the strategy, push it out to the community. They help build public will. They can advance policy, and they also help to mobilize funding. I included a couple of examples just to show you what this looks like in practice, and I'll just go over them briefly. With the juvenile justice system, where it all came out, was that there wasn't a backbone established actually inside a public agency, inside the governor's office. And the real focus of that effort was to sort of streamline the bureaucracy, make sure that coordination was happening. And one of the first things they did, just to give you an example of what can happen quickly, is one of the upstate facilities was actually shut down because people said, well, we can tell when we look across that taking students from youth from New York City and putting them in facilities upstate really does separate them from a lot of the support network and seems to lead to worse outcomes. So let's just shut that down. And that wouldn't have happened unless you had all the agencies at the table able to talk about that together, and certainly wouldn't have happened as quickly as it did. A more local example is happening in South Seattle and South King County, which is the Roadmap Project, which is focused on college attainment for underserved students in that region. And the urgency for that came from looking at data, with really unacceptable achievement gaps between low-income students and students of color with other students. And so they decided to come together, 7 school districts to come together and think about, how can we improve this? And so there was a backbone organization. They're putting out a report every year. They focused, again, the early things that you do are things like making sure students fill out their financial aid application forms, making sure that students are applying for scholarships. But over time, you're able to align efforts among the districts, between the districts and the community colleges, between the community colleges and the four-year universities. These are the things that take longer, but that really smooth out those pathways from kindergarten to a college degree. So I talked a little bit about the more concrete, observable things you can see. There's also a mindset shift that happens in this work, and you have to shift from what we call technical problem solving to adaptive problem solving. So the idea is technical problem solving is that sort of the complicated problem. You can figure out a solution that works and that will work every time you do it and will work as time goes on. With adaptive problem solving, you recognize that you're in a situation that's evolving, contexts are different, and so you have to have an approach that is open to taking in information and rethinking the solution that you thought you had as you take in that new information. And the collaboration really helps with that because you have multiple people thinking about the problem. You're talking all the time. There's that communication going on. No silver bullets. So again, the model in the social sector has been develop, pilot, scale up. But the idea here is that there's silver buckshot. There's lots of little innovations that folks across the community are doing. They see if they work or if they don't. If they work, they share them. But when you have this distributed knowledge and this distributed innovation, that actually is more effective than working out one solution in one place and then methodically trying to plant it in other places. Finally, credibility versus credit, and this is a difficult one. The model has been that organizations seek to show that they've made progress on an issue, that it's been their work that's resulted in the progress. When you're in a collaboration like this, it's quite hard to tell. If the community is doing better, well, who's responsible? Who is, the organization driving that? And you have to get out of that mindset a little bit. Now, there are always going to be government agencies are always going to demand accountability for dollars. Funders are always going to demand. I mean, the credit never totally goes away, but you have to shift more to how are we doing as a community? How are we working together? How can we be a little bit less worried about who's getting credit for what, and more worried about are we making progress overall as a community? Some of the intangible elements that we found both are important to make this work, but also emerge out of it. Relationship and trust building. Sometimes it takes 6 months to get to a common agenda because people haven't worked together before, and they just need to spend time together. They need to talk to each other. They need to know what their organizations are doing. They need to learn about each other. So that's both something that needs to be in place in order for it to work, but it's also an asset that once it's built continues to be valuable, because once those relationships are built, people continue to talk to each other. People continue to share ideas. People continue to say, well, this worked for me. You might want to try it, or we're facing this challenge. Can you have any thoughts on that from where you're sitting? It's very helpful in leadership identification and development because with that very complicated structure that I showed a few slides ago, folks from all over the community and from all different levels within organizations are involved in moving the work forward, and so it does give people a chance to get some leadership experience. You're creating a culture of learning in the community by gathering this data, using the data, feeding it back into a strategy. Folks build that capacity to think about how does the data coming in make me want to revise things, and thinking about evaluation less as, oh my gosh, this is our yearly report card, and more as this is great information, this can make us more effective at what we're trying to do. Building connections between people, and I think Laura did a great job of talking about why that's valuable, just building the community. And then finally, the power of hope, where when an effort like this gets started and gets some momentum, people begin to feel, wow, we may really get traction on this issue. Because very often these are issues that people have tried to improve before and haven't made much progress on. So seeing everybody at one table, having some early wins can really generate a lot of momentum just through that sense of hope.